Hello and welcome back to the economy stage here at the CogX Hybrid Festival 2021. I'm Felicity Birch and I'm the Director of Innovation and Digital at the Confederation of British Industry, the UK's largest business representative group, and I'm delighted to be the virtual MC for the economy stage today. Here on the economy stage, we're exploring the concept of building back better after the pandemic. What does it mean for all of us? Where are we really on the plan to remake our economies? And will we seize the opportunity to create a new and better society? We're going to start our next session in just a moment, but before we do, a quick reminder about how to get involved. Feel free to submit questions via Hopin throughout the session and tweet us via @CogX_festival or use the hashtag CogX2021 and submit questions throughout. Already today, we've had fascinating sessions on the role of public development banks. We've explored research on what the post-pandemic economy and society will look like and more. And up now, a question for the decade. What about China? We're joined by Annabelle Timsit and Zach Seward from Quartz to discuss this critical question. As the world's second largest economy, China has a grand strategy for itself and for the world that may just reshape the world's economy. The China of 2021 is bigger, bolder, and unafraid to fight back against what it sees as the global systems of norms and institutions rigged in favor of rich nations. This session will explore how the West, especially the EU, US, and the UK, can work with China on shared challenges whilst fighting against human rights abuses and avoiding economic war. So with that, I'd like to welcome Zach and Annabelle to our virtual stage.
Thanks so much for the introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us, and especially to Annabelle for making the time to talk with me and everyone else joining us live for today's panel. Welcome, Annabelle.
Thank you.
So we both work for Quartz, so you should get that out of the way. That's a big conflict of interest of this panel, but you're here to educate me and everyone else. I'm by day the CEO and co-founder of Quartz, and Annabelle, I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm the geopolitics reporter for Quartz based in London. And to be clear, I'm not sure to what extent I'll be educating you, but thank you so much, Zach, for taking the time to moderate this panel.
Sure thing. So the reason we're having this panel, and aside from it being possibly the most important news story of the moment, is about a month ago you published a series in Quartz, 12, is that right? 12 interviews with some of the most important watchers of UK-Chinese relations. I'm sure we'll drop a link in, so if you want to read all 12 interviews, it's a tour de force, as one person on Twitter called it. I want to get into a lot of the details, but first, need to know what inspired the project in the first place, why now, and why do it as a series of interviews?
Yeah, so thank you, Zach. Thanks to everyone who is here listening to us. So, you know, the purpose of this conference is to answer one question, and that is, how do we get the next 10 years right? The animating force for this conversation and for the series that I did is that there is no getting the next 10 years right without getting China right. China is at the center of every story, every industry, every country, every region in the world. And figuring that out is kind of the challenge for this time for Western powers. And so as a reporter sitting in London, I was watching this unfold and trying to put my finger on the pulse and figure out, you know, not just where are Western countries going on China, but also who is orienting them there and who is getting them there. And so I decided to have conversations with 12 of the most influential, like you said, academics, politicians, activists, individuals in the business community who sort of shape their government's China policy to try to figure out, in this moment, where do they stand and where do they see things going?
There's a bit of a moment of renaissance for policy, I feel like, in at least in UK and US politics, which for the last several years has been a little devoid. So policy wonks are on the rise, more genuinely, I think, more important and therefore more worth talking to, right? When we were talking ahead of this panel, you said something that kind of stopped me in my tracks, which was a variation of what you were just saying a moment ago. That China is really the story of my lifetime, is how you put it. Tell us a little bit more about why you see it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came to that realization that China was the story of my lifetime in the fall of 2019, which is an interesting timing. But I started realizing from conversations with folks around me, not just the people that I interview for my stories, because like you say, they're policy wonks and they would be watching this anyways. This is their area of coverage. But I mean, my grandmother, my friends, colleagues who don't really read or care about politics that this force in their lives, at least they perceived it to be, in a way that it just wasn't 2-3 years ago. People just didn't care in the same way. And that was in the fall of 2019 that I had already noticed that. But with COVID, it just exploded. People all of a sudden realized that a virus that originated there could shut down the world for, now 18 months and counting. And more broadly speaking, that decisions made in Beijing would affect their lives, as do decisions made in Washington, because China is a superpower. And so wherever you live in the world, decisions that are made in China can affect you. And so I think when people came to that realization, they started paying attention to this in a way that they hadn't before, hence ushering in the age of the policy wonks, as we'll call it.
So, well, one thing that really stood out for me in your series is the contrast between the UK's perception of China and vice versa. So in the UK, China is largely viewed as a threat and a growing one. Whereas similar surveys of the Chinese find a fairly positive perception of Brits, ranking second only to France. I learned from your series. Those are pretty fundamentally contrasting starting points for any dialogue between two nations, and would seem to me to frame the whole relationship. But would you agree?
Yeah. So let's step back for a moment, because the series is about UK-China relations, but the point I make in the introduction is that it's not a UK story, really. The UK is one of many countries that is trying to recalibrate its relationship with China. It's an interesting case study because it just left the European Union, and so it's trying to figure out its relationship with China at the same time as it's trying to figure out its own role in the world. And it's an important country. Both in international institutions, it has sort of an outsized role compared to, its size, population, and contribution to the global economy. So I picked it because I think it's important. But really, the larger point is that the China story is everybody's story. China is the world's second economy, the world's second largest economy. It's on its way to becoming the first, although we'll touch back on that because it's a challenging statement that I just made. 18% of the world population lives there. It's taking a bigger role in shaping global norms and practices on everything from CO2 emissions to lithium batteries. It's a leading innovator. It single-handedly has the power to make a difference in slowing climate change, and not a lot of countries can say that. It shapes global politics, same way that the US and the EU do, both on its own and through international institutions. Its military is increasingly assertive, both at home and abroad. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a global power in the making trying to figure out what it wants to do with all of this newfound influence. And that really, really matters. So to come back to the UK point and your question about that perception gulf, it's true that there is a lot of, I don't know if I call it goodwill, but positive perceptions of the UK and its contributions to the world amongst the Chinese population. I think that goodwill, if it was reflected in Chinese leadership, is sort of waning a little bit, especially in regards to the developments over the last year. I think, there was a period starting in 2015, especially, where the UK government positioned itself as sort of China's best friend in Europe. Arguably, that title was never really theirs. It was always Germany. But regardless, it wanted to be perceived as China's best friend in Europe. So it did a lot of things, actually, that the Chinese really appreciated. It joined the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. It sort of facilitated the way for Chinese investment in a way that they weren't used to. But that period is very much over. And COVID is what did that. COVID changed that. And so that perception gulf is going to become even more relevant as UK policy shifts closer to US policy on China, to what extent will that goodwill sort of stick around?
I buy that COVID was certainly the most significant change in the last year, certainly. But I want to push on the Brexit point you're making a moment ago. The central argument for Brexit was to free up the UK to pursue its own trading partnerships. And in the interim, China's been able to strike a number of new agreements with UK trading partners. UK has largely been stalled and certainly gotten nowhere with China itself. Would you say China won this round?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I would say that's not clear from the evidence that I see. So one thing is, this idea that they haven't made any progress. The UK and China aren't trying to negotiate a free trade agreement. And actually, there's a really big effort inside of the UK Parliament to legally prevent the UK from signing ever a free trade agreement with China. That effort hasn't succeeded so far, but it shows you sort of the depth of feeling that there is among the parliamentary majority, which keeps the government in power, in regards to that. So in that sense, I don't see that coming on the horizon at all. As to your question on, what has the UK been doing since Brexit, essentially, it's made some progress, actually, especially in the region. So it started formal discussions or accession talks to the CPTPP, which obviously is in China's backyard. It rolled over some of the free trade agreements it had with countries in Asia as part of the EU. So two examples that stand out are Singapore and Vietnam. I think the key question, and I should say it's attempting to negotiate at the moment a free trade agreement with Australia, which is really key, and with India, although it's less advanced in those conversations. So I think the key is there's a lot of ambition there for the UK to sort of establish itself as an Indo-Pacific power. I don't know that the results on the ground reflect that ambition, but it's there, and it's an open question whether it'll succeed in the next couple of years.
I suppose it's an unfair comparison to compare China's trade relationships in its own backyard to the UK's. So you said a moment ago that your feeling is it's unlikely a UK pursues a free trade agreement with China because it's not politically tenable right now in the UK, and that's largely over human rights and environmental concerns. And I want to talk about both. In a little bit more detail. There's a growing, I don't know if it's growing, you tell me if it's growing, but there's certainly a sizable chunk of UK-China watchers, US-China watchers, China watchers generally, who would argue that the internment of the Uyghurs by the Chinese government and what is in essence a genocide being conducted by the Chinese government is a red line in the sand and sort of ought to prevent any other kind of engagement with China until they're willing to relent or honestly even acknowledge the human rights abuses that it's conducting. I see the morals of that position are very clear, but it's a stark one, and it runs the risk of not engaging at all with China. How did you end up seeing the nuances of the human rights debate in the interviews you conducted with the 12 China watchers?
Yeah, so there's no consensus amongst Western countries as to whether what's happening in Xinjiang is a genocide. The US government has declared that it is. The Canadian Parliament and the UK Parliament and a couple of others, Lithuania and the Netherlands being the other two, I believe, have declared that. But most of the West hasn't said that. It has said that there are large scale, and to employ the words that the UK foreign minister used, industrial scale violations of human rights going on there. So just as there's no agreement amongst Western countries on this, there was no agreement amongst the 12 people that I interviewed for this series. And it's not just that they don't agree on the semantics. It's that they fundamentally disagree as to, the reality of what's happening. Is it sort of, problems like forced labor, which are terrible, but you also see them in other countries that the UK trades with? And so theoretically, under that premise, why would China be any different? Or is it, an unprecedented, or if not unprecedented, at least, genocide scale situation that's happening in Xinjiang? So, there's complete disagreement on that. And therefore, there's very little path forward. As I said earlier, the UK Parliament did endorse a motion. The House of Commons did endorse a motion that stated that there is a genocide happening there. There were a lot of sort of backroom politics on that particular vote. It represented the will of the House because it was endorsed without opposition, including from the government. But I think that doesn't mean, as some people would assume, that everyone in Parliament agreed. It just, it reflected, the particular politics of that vote. But there were a lot of people who sort of had reached out to me at the time to say that they disagreed. Of course, they didn't say so. So, you can argue that they must have not disagreed that much. So I think, that's definitely the defining question of that relationship is human rights and how you move forward on that. And I think forced labor will be sort of the way towards action in that sense, because it's kind of a concrete problem that governments like the UK can sort of impose rules on their own companies that are active in that region, as well as export of specific products like cotton.
Say a little bit more about that, because that does strike me as a way through what is otherwise just a really binary argument.
Yeah. So the key difference is there's very little that the government of the United Kingdom from London can do to influence what's happening on the ground in Xinjiang. That decision lies with the central government in Beijing. What it can do is ask its own companies, its own multinationals, which are quite active in Xinjiang. It's a country that it's a region that has a lot of economic activity. It can impose rules on those companies as to what they can do. For example, in the UK, there's a conversation around the Modern Slavery Act and rules as to making sure that your supply chain is free of forced labor and other kinds of repression. Putting in place export controls on the UK side to make sure that whatever products, goods are being exported to Xinjiang are not going to be used ultimately in a specific either military or security way. And there is more that activists are calling on the UK government to do that it hasn't done. For example, import controls, sort of moving beyond that. But, it's a really tough balancing act for those companies. A recent development that's really important is that China just passed a law to counter the sanctions that the EU, the US, and the UK have put in place on that region. And essentially, it's early days, but from what we've seen, it would make it illegal for companies from those countries that are active in China to implement the sanctions from their own country. So, I feel for them because they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they, let's say US companies, especially because the US government has quite a long arm on this stuff, a US company has to, implement or follow to the letter US sanctions. But if it does that, it might lose its access to the Chinese market. It might be stripped of its assets. Its staff members might be denied visas. Their staff members' families might be denied visas under this law. So, that's definitely a showdown to watch because it'll be sort of the determining factor on where human rights fit into all this.
Yeah, and so much of that debate, certainly in the U.S., but I think globally, it's fair to say, involves the tech industry. So, what there's a lot of focus right now, and the U.S. tech giants, sort of, who have grown their businesses in China, sort of, as you said, being between a rock and a hard place. And this is played out actually less along the lines of human rights issues and more as a national security question. And obviously, the most recent flashpoint of this in the UK and the US was over Huawei and its participation in the UK's 5G rollout, which ultimately ended in Huawei being banned from the country or sort of told to extricate itself over the next several years. What's the importance of that moment? Are we going to look back 10 years hence and see that as a breaking point where actually, there was a splintering in the global tech industry between the West and the East, or am I maybe over dramatizing that particular episode?
I think you're right in putting your finger on the fact that this was really a crucial event. And what is the event that we're referring to? Huawei is one of China's most successful exports. It's a tech company that had achieved pretty incredible supremacy in these fields in a short amount of time. The alliance of the U.S., UK, European Union, those countries have sort of soured on Huawei in the last year and a half, accusing it of being a national security threat. They've taken varying degrees of actions on that. The UK has, fully mandated that its 5G networks would be stripped of all Huawei equipment by a certain date, including all of the past equipment that was installed for 4G and 3G and 2G. So it wants a Huawei-free telecommunications network, essentially. The US has almost never really let in Huawei to begin with. And certain EU countries are weighing up the choices, risks, and benefits of doing that as well. So it's a good case study because it shows two things. One, it shows that the US still has, or at least still had when this happened, the power to do this. It's essentially brought a massive company to its knees financially. And so that probably for policymakers in Washington is an encouraging sign. I don't know that China would put its companies in a position for that to happen again in the future, now that it's seen this. But it also shows that, there's still no agreement as to whether Huawei was truly the security threat that it was perceived to be. So, for example, in the 12 sort of opinion shapers that I interviewed for my series, I could probably name you 12 different opinions as to how dangerous Huawei actually was to the UK. There was a national cybersecurity center that was established in the UK from 2010 onwards to evaluate the risk that Huawei equipment presented for the UK system. And year after year, it found that there was a risk, but that the risk could be managed. So there was no clear sort of trigger as to why this sort of happened, other than the fact that the US was pushing for it.
And the risk can be managed, I assume, through the regulatory requirements that, the equipment's being inspected by the government before it goes into the national infrastructure?
Yeah, not just that. They had a potential cap on the participation of Huawei in certain parts of the network. So one option that other countries have gone with is, instead of banning Huawei, making sure that Huawei can only take part in the non-core parts of the telecommunications networks, and up to a certain percentage, so around 30, 35%, as a way to manage and mitigate the risk. I mean, at the end of the day, you never want your telecommunications network or any critical infrastructure to rely entirely on one provider. That's a risk. People will argue that it's more of a risk with Huawei. Huawei certainly has always denied that. And there's not a ton of evidence that there's ever been, something that Huawei did to either spy or manipulate a particular country's network. But I guess the risk there was the potential of it happening down the line.
I'll admit, for those of us following it closely, but not expert in it or having to cover it, it's a kind of bizarre episode. I remember going to CES every year, and it must have been 2018 CES. Huawei had rented out half of the main exhibition floor. As you said, they kind of exploded overnight. They were at one point, it may still be the number one handset maker in the world, or by number of handsets. Mm-hmm. And then the next The next CES was one where famously they were set to announce a partnership with one of the U.S. carriers. I forget which now. That the U.S. pulled the plug on right before the announcement, in very clearly a power play that, you're right, proved effective. More recently, though, the U.S. sort of flailed in its attempt to deal with ByteDance, and I mean that was probably had a lot to do with the Trump administration sort of incompetence. But is there anything to be learned from that more recent episode where essentially the U.S. failed to block maybe the most recent successful Chinese export since Huawei entering the U.S. market and becoming a pretty popular app here and then the UK?
Yeah, I think the future is sort of bright for Chinese tech companies. They have this ability to capture that audience, that segment of the population that everybody wants, which is the sort of 18 to 34-year-olds, and they're spending dollars. I was actually just reading that Shein, which is a sort of an online clothing brand, has displaced Amazon as the most downloaded app on the U.S. App Store. So I think just because the U.S. was able to sort of coalesce a Western group against Huawei doesn't mean that it'll be able to do that to future Chinese tech giants. And I will say that the Huawei story kind of set a precedent for what's happening now, which is, like I mentioned, these multinationals getting stuck in the middle between US, China, and now potentially Europe-China tensions. Because, for example, in 2018, the Americans sent Americans asked Canadian authorities to arrest the CFO of Huawei while she was transiting through Vancouver, Meng Wanzhou, and she's now sort of going through the process of a trial where she's being accused of, not being transparent with HSBC and sort of enabling HSBC to violate U.S. sanctions on Iran. It's very much like, it feels like it's a very niche story, but actually it's not, because really it's about who gets to set the rules for the international system. Is it the case that when the US decides that it wants to sanction a country, for example, Iran, everyone else sort of has to follow them? Or is it the case that China on its own has the power to create a different path for itself and an alternative system? And there are real people who are getting caught in the middle. So not just the CFO of Huawei, who's on trial in Vancouver, but also 2 Canadian citizens who were arrested right after Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Vancouver and who remain in jail in China. And so, these conversations have real consequences.
Turning to a different topic, where the national security debate has always seemed quite ambiguous, the question of environmental concerns is exactly the opposite. It's very clear that China, like all of the world's large polluters, has to take really drastic action to cut its carbon emissions if, as a globe, we're to have any chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change. Could you? There's a big conference, COP26, coming up later this year, at which there is some hope that we might see a climate agreement that includes China. Whether it's exactly what everyone's hoping for, well, we can be sure that it won't be. But how good an agreement they can achieve obviously remains to be seen. Could you set the scene for us ahead of COP26 and maybe attempt your own prediction? Will we see China participate in that agreement?
Yeah. So I think to a certain extent, we've seen a preview already of the commitments that China is willing to make at this stage. It's committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. And it's committing to, by a certain date, cut its emissions in half. And I think there are real signs of goodwill when it comes to China on climate change. Just the way that it affects all of us, it affects China. I was reading, a Financial Times analysis actually that was estimating the financial cost of the rise of sea levels. And it was going to cost $974 billion just for the city of Shanghai in terms of being exposed to oceans rising as a result of climate change. So they have the same interest that we all do. in slowing that process. So, I think that is an area of positive cooperation that remains intact. The problem is, will politics get in the way even of that? I think it gets to a point where once two countries or one country against everybody else, once relations are so poisoned, it sort of gets to everything. So I think on COP26, if I were to hazard a guess, I think that there will be an agreement. I think that historically, it's been shown that there is a sort of that wiggle room and that ability for change and action on that particular subject. There's also a big biodiversity conference taking place in China, or scheduled to take place. We don't know at this stage. So there's movement, and there are things that are set to happen. But politics could still get in the way. Absolutely.
Well, what's the most likely to derail it?
So one example is that after the UK imposed sanctions along with the EU, Canada, and the US on officials in Xinjiang and a government-linked entity, the Chinese were invited to attend a pre-summit meeting with the UK and several other countries, and they declined to attend. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to happen in the future. It's sort of a immediate reaction to a specific geopolitical development. But I think that what British diplomats are looking to do now is sort of keep things as stable as possible and avoid major challenges ahead of that summit, because then China might feel sort of backed into a corner and forced to respond by doing something that would jeopardize the deal at the summit. And let's not forget that the reason we're having this conversation in the first place is because the US completely deserted its role as a climate change leader over the last 4 years and left, a wide open gap for other countries to fill in.
Yes, that is a great point. So I want to turn to some questions from the audience, and I've got plenty more to ask as well if we in our last 10 minutes here. But one question that just came in from Andrew relates to what we were talking about a moment ago before we turn to climate change, and that is this perception that just as manufacturing jobs and manufacturing as an industry was dominated by China. Now too is innovation, and I think more specifically people tend to refer to investment in artificial intelligence as being the new battleground between East and West. And there's a perception, at least, and I put it that way intentionally, that China is in the lead here. Do you agree with the perception? And then if so, you can answer Andrew's question, which is how does the West keep its lead? What happens if it doesn't?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the US is still an incredibly innovative place. It has a sort of economic, it's very welcoming to businesses and to innovation and startups, both in its tax system and just in its general economy. But I think it's pretty undeniable that there's this just stunning amount of innovation happening in China. And I was just reading about some of the innovations that have taken place in the public health field in the course of the pandemic, the thousands and thousands of startups that were invented to make it easier to contact trace, to send test results in centralized ways. So I think that the fact that there is this innovation taking place in Asia and in China more specifically is undeniable. I think that the US hopes to sort of kickstart its own innovation in response to that. So the Senate just passed a bill. It's sort of the only major piece of legislation that is expected to pass the Senate this year that sort of makes that exact point. We need to invest in manufacturing at home, in innovation. We need to invest in the companies that make semiconductor chips. We need to invest in alternative supply chains for rare minerals, for batteries. And he makes that point because I think, the Biden administration realizes that it's not just going to compete with China by getting everybody else to, ban Huawei and sort of see China as a threat. It's going to compete with China if it continues to keep its position as an innovator, as the place where the smartest students from all over the world want to go and study and work potentially for, some of the world's biggest and most successful companies. So I think the US is trying to do that. It's very much an open question whether it will be able to match those ambitions with action.
This past weekend, G7 meeting concluded with a number of statements, including what's being called the Cornwall Consensus, which I don't see catching on, but viewed as sort of a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative by increasing the details were vague at this point, increasing investment. Foreign investment by the G7 nations to sort of compete, in essence, with China. What do you think was the most significant part of the G7 with respect to China? Was it that announcement? Would you point to anything else that struck you as critical?
I think the most significant part of the G7 when it comes to China is that China was the number one topic. I mean, that's not an obvious thing. Like we say that now, like it's to be expected. But I was just hearing a U.S. diplomat say that 3 years ago China wasn't even an issue at the G7, and now it's sort of the central thread of the entire sort of Cornwall Consensus, as you said, that the communique, the joint plan for action that these countries have put out. And if you were to ask me what specific policy is the most revealing, it definitely is this idea of a Western alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you're looking for a sign that China is setting the agenda globally, then look no further than that, right? I mean, Belt and Road is very much a Chinese domestic project that was developed, a little bit under 10 years ago to fund various infrastructure projects, both digital and concrete bridges and roads, and to better connect the world, to facilitate trade and other exchanges. And a lot of people, when it was first invented, thought it was kind of crazy, or that it was nothing, that it was a name slapped onto or that it was a name slapped onto a couple of random projects, sort of retroactively calling them BRA projects. But it's clearly not. And not only is it clearly not, but now Western powers feel the need to come up with an alternative to it. So I think that that's extremely significant. Again, open question as to whether it will be able to compete. But I think the idea that there is this competition and that the West feels the need to be smarter about how it uses its power and its money to invest in developing countries in a way that is not just, we will provide you with aids and vaccines, but also we will fund your roads so that your economy can develop and you can succeed in the long term. I think that's a good thing.
For sure, and totally, I totally agree with you that would not have predicted a year ago a lot of things. It wouldn't have predicted that certainly that China would be the top topic at the G7. I want to end where we began, which was the premise of this full discussion, really the series you did, and I think most conversation about China begins with the rise of China and what is the West going to do about it. It assumes that China's rise is inevitable. I'm curious how you see it. Is it in fact inevitable, or there are some headwinds facing China? We've spoken mostly about the West today. I want to hear in the 2 minutes we have left, the Chinese perspective. What might thwart their rise over the next few decades?
You could write a book about that, and a lot of people have, and I get 2 minutes, but I will do my best. So I'm guilty, like a lot of people, of using the phrase China's rise to mean a whole lot of nothing. You really would have to specify, but I think that to shift to the second part of your question, which is, are there challenges and roadblocks in the way of China becoming, a superpower and potentially the world's largest economy, although, again, some people think it already is. But yes, there are absolutely challenges. So one very clear one that has become more and more obvious recently is demographics. The China's population is aging. Chinese people are not having enough children to sort of match that aging population in terms of age dependency ratio and people funding older people's retirement. There are huge environmental challenges that it's facing. And it has the twin challenges of both corruption and economic inequality. The corruption aspect is being tackled very actively by the central government through these gigantic anti-corruption purges. But social inequality is a tougher beast to tackle, and the US and plenty of other Western countries struggle with it as well. So I think that those are sort of the major challenges China faces, and whether or not it succeeds in tackling them will determine to what extent it'll become sort of the world superpower.
Strikingly similar headwinds to the US.
Yeah.
Well, Annabelle, thank you so much for your time today and for conducting those interviews, which I think really set the stage for the next year plus of conversation about China in the UK and elsewhere. So appreciate that work, and thanks and thanks everyone for joining us for today's conversation. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Zach.
Well, thank you, Zach and Annabelle, for a fascinating discussion. I loved Annabelle's comment at the start that China's story is everyone's story. It's shaping global norms, it's become a global innovation heavyweight, and it's shaping global politics as well. And clearly decisions being made in China are now starting to affect us all. I think you really brought out how for the UK that's particularly pertinent as one of the countries that's trying to recalibrate its relationship with China now alongside its relationship with Europe, and really drew out some of the particular questions that we're going to have to answer around human rights, tech and national security, and climate change. So it's clear this is going to be a tough balancing act, but a vital relationship in the coming decade. So thank you both very much. For those of you who are sticking around on the economy stage, the next session is at 4 p.m. where we'll be hearing from Gillian Tett. The session is called Using the Power of Anthrovision to Understand Human Behavior and Drive Change, and it's going to explore how anthropology, the scientific study of human behavioral patterns and underlying meaning, has found new domains of research in business and economy. So go and make a cup of tea, or if you're sweltering in London like me, a cold drink, and join us at 4 p.m. for that session. And don't forget, you can tweet us at CogX_festival or use the hashtag CogX2021 to continue the conversation. I'll see you at 4 p.m.